Hi, everybody. Welcome to Conversations with Calvin We the Species. And we're back. Uh, Sounds like that's they're back. It sounds like poltergeist. Back. And I'm trying to keep in the theme. We're doing Lifeblood 2. It's a panel, and Gary is holding it up. This is our second panel talking with contributing writers to Lifeblood 2. It's a second panel. This is also July 5th. Just putting this chronologically. And I'm thrilled to do this because I've read and I've drifted into the world of Lifeblood 2, and I've learned a tremendous amount of things about vampires that I didn't know, and it's been kind of transformative in me to appreciate a whole new world. And my friend Gary and I, we met, and we've done a few of these, and Gary's orchestrated this, and today we are privileged to have Mike Korn and Renee Mulhare, R.C. Mulhare, with us. And this is a panel talking about their work, their writings, and we'll drift off wherever we have to drift off, because it's an endless amount of things that we can talk about. And I think the best part of this now is if you all, by the way, for you spiritual observers out there, or your observers of synchronicities of life, for whatever reasons, the four of us are all wearing hats. And you can figure that out. Mike studies some psychology. He can figure that out. I don't know what that
we're all trying to conceal something.
Probably
maybe
it's the hat chat.
Maybe that's a very good analysis. Maybe. So let's start with a little bio with Gary, and then we'll kind of move around. Take it away, Gary.
Okay, so I've done quite a few of these with Calvin, and if you guys are frequent viewers of these things, you probably are tired of me. But let's just say I started Music Street Journal in 1998, doing music reviews and interviews and things. I published my first book, which I don't know if you can see it, but there's a cover back there, Strange Sound of Cthulhu, music inspired by the writings of H.P. Lovecraft in 2006. And then since then, I've written a lot of short stories, fiction and nonfiction stuff. And I started Tales of Wonder and Dread publishing almost 4 years ago now, and have published, I don't know, 26, 28 books, something like that.
Nice.
Including milestone last weekend. I published the first book by an author, a book that I didn't actually construct or compile or write myself, by Elizabeth Lynn Blackson, nice, which is an amazing book, and it just came out on Saturday, and she's an awesome author. And I'm really happy to be doing some full books by people other than myself. It's kind of a milestone in a new phase for Tales of Wonder and Dread. So yeah, that's pretty much me. Well, I also do Spooky Ventures, which will do spooky videos and things. So that's that.
Okay, Mike.
Well, by strange coincidence, I started my major writing thing virtually the same year that Gary did, the year that we met. I did like a little paper fanzine called Wormwood Chronicles that started out being stapled together in my bedroom. And it grew to a large, like over 50 pages. And then we had to convert to the internet because it was tough getting the advertising for the print zine. And with just a couple of hiccups, it's gone now pretty close to 22 years.
Wow.
And we write on a variety of subjects. Music is the big thing, but we've also got like a paranormal column. We write about like cult movies and underground movies. We got a little bit of a wrestling column that we do. I also write for Music Street Journal now and then for Gary's publication, and another webzine called Ravenous Monster. I've got quite a few articles up there, and another one should be out this week. Outside of that, not too much to tell that would be interesting. That's my main output is Wormwood and the other zines that I mentioned.
Let me add, if you go to Wormwood, my stuff is there too, but you won't see it under my name. It's under Dark Star. So
Yeah, I write as Dr. Abner Malady. That's my pen name. So once in a while you'll see stuff under my real name, but not too often.
Okay, Renee, RC.
All right. Well, I've been writing almost since before I could actually write. I think the first thing I quote unquote wrote was a story that I dictated when I was 4 years old to my mother, and I think she still has it in a drawer somewhere. But I've been writing off and on ever since then. Although I didn't get published until about 7 years ago when I met up with a group called the New England Horror Writers when they did a panel discussion at our local library. And I was kind of in a sort of between stage. I'd just come off of a rather a weird summer where there was a labor dispute at the grocery store where I work, and I'd gotten laid off temporarily, but then I'd gotten my job back, and I was like, well, I'd face my fear of losing my job and then getting it back. What's next? So I thought, okay, I'm gonna face my next fear and try getting published, because I got chatting with this one guy, and he asked me how long I'd been writing, and I said, well, I've been writing since I was knee high to a knee, blah, 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 blah. And he says, well, why aren't you published yet? And I said, well, I work grocery retail. It takes a lot of my time and energy. So he says, well, how long have you worked grocery retail? And I said, well, I've worked it about 13 years. He looks me in the eye and he says, if you can work grocery retail for 13 years, you can get published. And I thought, well, why the heck not? You know, it's like there's a certain toughness that you have to have, and when you're doing grocery retail. And it's the same thing that you need when you're getting published, because you are going to have rejections, you know, left and right. And you got to, you know, learn to roll with them. And I certainly have. So since then, I've had about closing on 90 stories, most of it horror, some science fiction, some fantasy. Most of it's published with indie publishing, although I've got a few little small projects of mine that I tossed up on my Patreon page. But it's been an interesting ride. I kind of almost stumbled into horror. I didn't think of myself as a horror writer per se, although I've liked spooky stuff since I was a kid, and my mom was, you know, quoting Edgar Allan Poe poems to me, and, you know, reading Grimm's fairy tales with me. Plus, I do live across the street, catty corner from an old New England cemetery, and I wouldn't say I was the kid that hung out in the cemetery, but it was like, oh, I walked through the cemetery and, you know, running errands and what have you. And it was just no big deal. You know, it was just part of the landscape for me. So I'd actually tried getting into science fiction, but the kind of science fiction I was writing, it was sort of like 5 minutes into the future kind of stories. And it seemed like the technology kept surpassing what I was creating. So I kind of took a step back from that. And then fantasy fiction, I was kind of on the fence about writing, because at the time it was like almost like stuff was almost in the same ballpark as George R.R. Martin was really popular. And that was just not something that I was, you know, really felt capable of writing. But something dawned on me was that people are always going to be scared of something. You know, fear is, you know, like H.P. Lovecraft put it, fear is the oldest and strongest emotion known to man. Well, that's a very crude paraphrase rather, but I thought, I can do this. I can write about the things that go bump in the night and how people react to it and what's causing the bumps in the night. So that's, I basically just kind of, you know, I like to say the horror, I didn't choose the horror writing life. The horror writing life chose me, as the kids would put it. So that's what got me into it.
Interesting. So we're going to drift into, as I like to hold it up, we're going to drift into Lifeblood 2, which I've basically read.
Good man.
And I want to, I guess, start with the vampire Edna. Now, Lifeblood 2 is broken down into two sections, fiction and nonfiction, and both so interesting. And we were talking for 40 minutes before we went on air, just to familiarize ourselves with each other. And if I in my own interpretive way, making a judgment about what I've read on the fiction side, and then on the nonfiction side, what I've observed is the whole institution of vampirism went from whatever it was back then to now, to what I call reading the Vampire Edna, which you wrote, Renee, RC. There's such an element in my world of believability, and that's one of the things I'd love to talk about as you develop, Edna Gilhooly, from the beginning of the story to the end. For me, I'm saying to myself, it's like really real. So,
That's more or less what I had in mind. It was like I wanted to write a story, and it kind of grew out of working in grocery retail, and the people that you meet there. But I kind of was thinking, what would you get if you had vampires shopping in a grocery store? That's more or less where it started. Plus, it also grew out of a line that I constantly heard from several of my older customers. Oh, we'd be rich if we didn't have to eat. And I'm thinking to myself, well, okay, and I'm thinking to myself, what creature doesn't eat? And I'm thinking, okay, vampires, they don't really subsist on solids. They subsist on blood. So I was thinking, okay, that kind of was the germ of the story. As I was thinking, what would you get if an average late middle-aged person were to get changed into a vampire very unexpectedly? How would they adapt? How would this, how would they figure out how to navigate this new, this very life-changing event that, inverts their complete, their life schedule. So, okay, now they got to sleep during the day and, do their regular activities at night. How do they adapt to that? How do they figure out where to get blood? And it kind of evolved from that. Plus, there was also an interesting incident where I had a guy come through my lane in the checkout, because I worked in the checkout mostly. And he had these two containers with this reddish stuff in it. And I was like, what the heck is that? And he's like, oh, it's beef blood. And I was like, beef blood? Because I had never seen it in our store before. And he says, yeah, I'm using it to make my grandmother's blood sausage recipe with. And I was like, that's a thing?
yeah.
I had never heard of it before. So then I looked into it, and there's this whole, there are recipes using animal blood in different stuff. I mean, of course, it's congealed by the time you start working with it, but, and I thought, okay, not just good for blood sausage, it might also be good for a vampire if they're doing their grocery shopping. So that's, I just basically, I found myself that I had to write this story because it was just too, having these ideas circulating in my head. I just had to run with it and just, write a story about, a person who becomes your friendly neighborhood vampire. And that's kind of, that's where it went.
Again, for me, it's very, very believable. But you had an element there that intrigued me, because I watched a ton of monster movies growing up, and even past that into modern times. But there was one, I'm trying to remember which movie it was, but a whole bunch of townspeople get together. I don't know if it was the Wolfman, I don't remember, but there was Deacon, the townspeople in your book. They're marching through the woods with torches and bats and stuff, and that's right out of a scene of a black and white tech noir a horror movie. I don't know if you relate to that, or that
I
was,
didn't, yeah, I didn't really grow up watching those, although I kind of started getting into them more almost about the same time that I seriously started writing horror, and I kind of treat it as almost like not exactly a crash course in classic horror, but I felt like, okay, I need to, you know, engage with more of what's gone before so I can have a better idea of, you know, not exactly what to write, but just, just inspiration and just how to do it.
okay,
And yeah, we got into watching Svengoolie a lot once we found it on one of the nostalgia stations up here. And yeah, we just and which is kind of odd because my family really isn't a horror family, but my dad was watching. I was like, oh yeah, I've seen some. I saw this when I was a kid, and he's not big on horror, but he likes the old black and white stuff. So we kind of bonded over that. And yeah, I kind of had the image of Edna being the kind of person that, yeah, she grew up watching, the old black and white horror movies, when she was a teenager or whatnot, either in the theaters or, on the late night, creature feature type stuff. And I kind of had the mental image of her sort of, she engaged with that. She grew up with that, and then, kind of thought about, well, what would it be like to be a vampire? And just, it was just one of those things that just kind of faded into the background of her head as she goes about her ordinary life. And then all of a sudden she's living this life that she kind of sort of thought about, and finding that it's completely different from what it is in the movies. And it was just kind of almost like a play on the fact that they portray certain things certain ways in the movies, but the real life version of whatever the thing is completely different. It's not as exciting and glamorous as the movie makes it out to be. Doesn't make the movie wrong, it just makes the movie fiction,
right,
as opposed to what reality is like. So that's kind of where I was going with that, was, what the fantasy version would be like versus what the plausible reality version would be. And I seriously wanted to go for a plausibility angle, because who knows, there could be some kind of virus out there that could, change a person. Because another one thing that I read, and I had just read this, is just even before I got into horror, was I think it's by an author called Catherine Ramsfield, and I think the title of it is something like The Science of Vampires. And she does a deep dive into just how vampirism could work. Looks at different animal species that
oh, wow,
do, yeah, do in fact, subsist on blood, and how maybe, just maybe, this could work on a human being. I mean, it would have to rewire a lot of stuff in a person's physiology, but she dug deep into it, and that it kind of left an impression on me, even before I got into horror, per se. I mean, I was looking at it more from the science angle, and you know
I,
how something
I,
fantastical could in fact work. So that was kind of in the back of my head as I was writing it, although I went in completely different directions from what she got into, but still, it did have an impact on how that story, you know
okay,
sort of
Mike,
spooled out of my head.
I read a series of books a long time ago. I'm trying to recall the author's name, but the first book was called The Empire of Fear. And it was very much based on the scientific aspect of vampirism as a disease. And it sort of theorized a world where basically the vampires were the royalty. They were the royal people that ran Europe and stuff. And one guy, for one reason, had found like a cure for it. And well, of course, the ruling classes, they don't want to be cured. That's the secret to their power. And he found out it originated in Africa. So he took a trip there to see if he could find out more about it. And it was fascinating because they described, kind of like a culture where like King Richard the Lionheart was still around in the 1600s
Oh
because
my.
he was a royal vampire.
Wow.
And there was no, history was different. I don't want to go into it too much because it became very intricate.
Mm.
But America never became an independent country because the vampire legions that ran it direct from Europe couldn't be beaten. They couldn't be beaten in battle. It was a very fascinating take on it, how it changed history and how it changed science, and how science was almost frowned on and forbidden because the powers that ran everything didn't want people to discover the secret of vampirism. I think the author's name was Brian Aldiss, but I might be wrong. But that was back in the 80s, and I was really fascinated by those books. They really took that approach very seriously.
So I'm listening to you guys, and something's, something popped into my head. It's not off topic, but and correct me if I'm wrong, but vampires have eternal life, correct?
As long
More or
as they
less.
can get what they need.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we here on this planet spend, I just saw the other day, 10 or 20 billion dollars a year on vitamins to give us longer life. And there's all kinds of research, longer life. Well, it would seem to me that in of course this is fiction, but it would seem to me that I would line up and wait 18 hours for somebody to bite my neck so I could live forever. If we here as a species, but I'm saying, what's so bad? I mean, you can't hang out in the daytime, but otherwise, that's what I'm throwing out to you guys. As I'm seeing what I'm reading in Life Led To, the believability of this, wouldn't it? I would run around a cemetery trying to find a vampire to bite me, so that I could. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Yeah, in my vampire universe, because I've got, as you notice, my stories are all interconnected into like one vampire universe. And in my vampire universe, and in fact, I think one of the stories in there, in Dragon's End, they talk about it a little bit, about how they didn't used to have rules, and it became a problem because the vampires sort of look at it as the humans are sort of like livestock. You need to keep a certain number of them around, which means you need to keep your numbers small enough that you don't wind up consuming them all, and you don't wind up visible enough for them to hunt you down. And so they've got a whole ruling system that decides, how you need to stay hidden and how you keep your numbers low. You have to have permission to turn someone into a vampire. You can't just go out and do it. Because honestly, if there were vampires and it were like anybody they bite turns into a vampire, it wouldn't be long till they'd run out of food, because you'd have all these immortals walking around looking for humans to bite, and there just aren't enough humans. But yeah, so that's sort of where I went with it.
Okay. Now, taking switching hats, since we're all wearing one. You wrote, and this was all new to me, but you wrote a nonfiction thing, Gary. And that'll segue into Mike's work, Wormwood Files. But so you wrote something, was Elizabeth Bathory and a vampire torturer and murderer. And of course, I never heard of her until I read you, and then parenthetically, I read Mike's work. Can you talk about her, because she's in the Guinness World Book of Records, which is meaningful. She was a bad lady.
Well, here's the thing about that. Now, Mike and I think, have somewhat different opinions of her, and honestly, it's up to what part of history everybody reads and believes. Obviously the victors are the ones that write history. And that's why, like, all these stories are coming out about Vlad the Impaler that may very well be exaggerated because they were written by the people who he subjugated. And, so they're the ones that are going to hate him and blah, blah, blah. Similarly, the thing about Elizabeth Bathory, number one, it said that she had epilepsy. Well, at the time, epilepsy, a couple of the cures for epilepsy, they thought that rubbing blood on your lips and or brain material from people would would help your epilepsy. So she probably did that to help with her epilepsy. Also, there was a little bit of a thing going on where the king in her area, her husband owed the king owed her husband lots and lots of money. When her husband passed away, a lot of the stories that came out about all of the torturing and stuff that she did came from the king, who was the one who passed down her judgment and basically took all of the resources that her husband had, which wiped out his debt. So it's actually really, really possible that very little of that story is true. But if it is true, she did torture a lot of children and stuff. And that wasn't uncommon in those days. The ruling class did tend to look on the peasants as sort of almost livestock. Again, back to that. They would do what they wanted with them. And she could very well have been a really cruel person. A lot of those people were. So there might be some truth in it. There might be no truth in it. Or, I don't think it's all true, probably. But supposedly some people say she bathed in the blood to stay youthful. And Mike's got a different take on it. I know that.
All right, Mike, we'll segue into the Wormwood Files, Vampire Tales. There's a bunch of, not a bunch, but you introduced some really interesting characters, real characters. So if you wanted to kind of chat about them, some of them scary people.
Yeah. I just did an article that was how vampirism intrudes into the real world. And of course, I write a good bit about Countess Bathory in there, and it is true that the time and place that she lived was very brutal. I mean, there not a lot of the rulers of those times would be considered philanthropists or good people. But I don't find it much of a stretch that somebody got so used to being immune that they treat peasants and lower people, just treat them basically like cattle or just there to be used. So I did write about her, and then I can't remember the fellow's name, escapes me now, the immigrant gentleman over in Europe that died in his apartment, who had such an abnormal fear of vampires that everything in his life was dominated by that. And in a real ironic way, it wound up killing him anyway. I mean, his room was full of garlic. They had containers that mixed like salt and urine and garlic and
Demetrius Mayakura.
Yeah, that's it. That's him. And he was a guy that sort of fell between the cracks of life. He lived a real quiet life in England, and nobody really knew much about him. And one day he didn't show up, and they went in, and the cops found this bizarre scene in his apartment. So when you were talking earlier, Mr. Schwartz, about putting the garlic on the windows and stuff like that, that's immediately my mind jumped to that. Only this guy took things 10,000 times more serious. His actual cause of death was choking to death on a clove of garlic.
Oh my!
And I've seen the picture of his body when it was not very pleasant. I mean, he'd been dead for a few days. He was completely contorted, and mouth was hanging open. He was on a a bed, and he had put newspapers all around the bed. So anybody walking, would make a crackle or a noise and he'd wake up.
Oh my.
Crosses were everywhere. It was just like a kind of a mania that sort of overtook his life and finally put an end to it. But he came from a part of the world where the belief in vampirism was very, very strong. And the vampires, the traditional ones, were not sexy characters.
Not at all.
Yeah, they didn't walk around in business suits or go into parties or anything like it. They stank like a corpse. I mean, they were repulsive to look at. Couldn't speak, most of them. It was a very different concept of a vampire in those locations and time. And there are still places in Romania, even today, where that belief runs pretty high.
Wow.
But yeah, I once I read that story of Mayakura, I had to write something about it because that was a strange tale for sure.
Yeah, I
Wow.
wrote that down in my notes, and yes, we talked about this before we went on air. When I was a young kid growing up, 11, 12, 13 years old, I used to babysit for my two little sisters, and I would watch exactly these horror, the Wolfman and Frankenstein and Dracula and all this stuff. And I was so petrified that I used to get garlic powder and sprinkle it on the windowsills. I was petrified. And I was a poor kid. If I would have had a couple of bucks in my pocket, I would have gone to a jewelry store and bought a crucifix to have, because that's the power. But Mike, you wrote about some murders in Florida in the 1990s that were rather horrific, that might
Yeah.
have had some vampiric undertones.
Yeah, it was basically like a cult that practiced vampirism for real. I mean, they eventually were arrested and the ring was broken up. They weren't supernatural creatures, but they drank blood, and occasionally this sort of mania pops up down through the ages, and that was a recent manifestation of it. But people were really killed in that. It's not something, I'm sure the cops, when they thought there were vampires running around, they kind of had to take it a little bit more serious in that case.
Gary, going back, again, we're talking about Lifeblood 2. Going back to what you wrote about Elizabeth Bathory, I think to give her more credence on just how bad she was, you wrote about the fact that Guinness labeled her the most prolific woman murderer in history. So that, Guinness is pretty reliable, isn't it?
Yes, but on the other hand, you look at it this way, they were going off of records that were written hundreds of years ago. And there's nobody alive for them to interview about it. Nobody who was actually there. So, just like anything in history that far back, all we have to rely on is what somebody wrote. And, what records remained are the people who remained in power. Especially, back then, not a lot of people knew how to write. So I don't know what we should believe and what we shouldn't believe, but it's hard to say. And it's kind of odd that because Guinness does, like, especially contemporary stuff, they're very, very good at checking that stuff out. But those old historical ones, what really do they go on? They go on historical records, and there's no real way to verify that stuff.
The records of that trial, because she was put under trial,
Yeah.
are pretty easy to find. Any trials involving the nobility or the people that were higher up they kept the records as a matter of course.
But on the other hand, if you've got the king is the one who is wanting you out of the way, especially now, even today, it's pretty easy for someone like that to really manipulate witness testimony, manipulate who knows what. But even then, it was much more so. So, I don't know how much we can believe. Then again, I'm always the skeptic. I'm always looking to, look at what the real facts are and try to look behind it. So that's just sort of the way my mind works. I'm willing to demystify things as much as possible if there's an option to do that. So that's just the way my mind works.
So let me ask you all a question that just popped into my head as we're discussing this. Would Hollywood ever consider making a movie? Would it be too gory? Would it be too horrific on the life of Elizabeth Bathory?
Well, they already have.
Blood,
They
right?
have?
They already have Countess Dracula.
Countess Dracula. That's
Oh,
right.
wow.
With the first one, that was by Hammer in the early 70s. I saw it like about 7 or 8 months ago. And there's also been a more contemporary version of that, one of these direct-to-video movies. I haven't seen that one, so I can't quote on it, but I mean, since it's in modern times, I'm sure it's a bloodbath.
Yeah.
The Countess Dracula one was not something you would go to for his real historical accuracy. But it was based on her. It was
Wow.
definitely her story.
Wow.
Hmm.
A little segue, since we're talking about Hollywood, and again, part of the theme of this panel is the overall believability, how vampirism was treated when Bram Stoker, started that to today, and reading Renee's work about Edna, going to a supermarket buying blood, presumably for blood sources, but that's believable. I mean, that's like, this is modern day stuff. So and impact wise, and we talked about this too before we went on air. I watched that movie Fright Night. It's semi-comedic, but it's also heavy duty. It's real life.
They treated the vampires seriously. They didn't turn them into comedians.
No.
Oh,
Which
except maybe for Evil Eddie.
Well, even he was not a character you'd want to run into.
No, but he was a little comedic. He
Yeah.
was a little over the top.
Yeah.
but the impact that it had going back, and I'm just using myself as an example, going back when in the movie House of Wax came out with
Vincent Price one, or the one that came before it?
No, the one with Vincent Price.
Yep.
To this day, I mean, I actually saw it a couple of years ago again, and I realized, we've come a long way in movie making since back in the 50s. But as a young kid, that scene of that possible pretty woman being turned into wax had a lasting effect on me. So what I'm saying is there's great power in both the written word, which you're doing, and there's great power also in the visual side. Do you guys consider that when you write things, the power that you're wielding in creating, especially for younger, impressionable people, kids?
You have to no special effect ever created can match the human imagination. I mean, you could write, when you write a story, you don't have to worry about a budget, you know, or doing things technically. You can just, with a few choice words, let your reader do the work for you, you know, usually. I'm reading some short stories right now, and I kind of see them in my mind as movies, but I wonder if the actual movie would ever be as good as what I see. And usually the answer is no.
Interestingly enough, when I write fiction, I see it as a movie. And if I had the skill set and the budget, I'd probably do them as movies, but I don't. So I put them down in words because that's how it always works to me. And, you know, it's interesting because you mentioned, what if younger people read this stuff, or whatever do you consider that? Funny, I found out recently that our 10-year-old granddaughter considers me her favorite author, and she's read a ton of the books I've put out and loves it.
Wow.
And she loves those stories, and she's into very dark stuff and creepy stuff. That said, there are works of mine that I wouldn't want her to read. They're definitely too over the top. And I've got another vampire story that's coming out in Horrifying Halloween, and also in Spooky Berwyn 2 this fall, that is the darkest, grittiest, just plain evilest thing I've ever written. And I mean, I got done writing it, I was like, did I go too far with this? Because it's just sort of, I've taken, you know, I took, with my vampire world, I took them and sort of went with the Vampire the Masquerade kind of thing, where they're sort of the glamorous, they're not quite glamorous, but they're sort of likable characters. And now, because I'm getting ready to turn it all into one big book with all these stories gathered together, the darker side is coming out. And without getting into too much information, the story that I just finished, which I've only done the first draft so far, one of the vampires is watching, there are all these stories about vampire killings in the Chicago area. And he's curious about it because, you know, he wants to know who is getting attention to vampires. And so he's a private detective. So he does his private detective work, and he finds that there's a serial killer going around and torturing women and killing them and making it look like vampire killings. Does he stop them? No, he uses it for his advantage. He sits and watches. Well, he doesn't watch. He sits outside the window and listens while the guy tortures someone to death. And then only when he's done does he pay attention, because he's like, I don't really want to hear all that screams. I'm tired of that stuff. But he's not a good, and he's like, what, did you think I was going to stop it? I'm not a good guy, you know? So it's like, I went much darker with it this time. And it's like that. So something like that, I wouldn't want kids to read by any means.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead, Renee.
Yeah, I'm much like Gary in my writing process, is in that oftentimes I'll start with like one image or one bit of dialogue, and it's like I got to tell the story that works up to this moment. So I do kind of have a cinematic take on how I'm writing it. It does tend to play as a mini movie in my head. I mean, I'll even, you know, up to and including, I'll, you know, mentally cast, you know, actual actors as if, you know, in my mind, you know, if I were like a casting director for, you know, the movie that is this story, you know, who would I want playing this role? And it does kind of help to keep, you know, my focus anchored on, you know, how is this gonna look? How is this gonna play out? So it does work out that way. And, you know, I kind of do hope that, you know, my story does have that effect on, you know, some person reading this, you know, whether they're a younger person or an older person, that, you know, this thing will give them that moment where they, you know, they have to leave the light on as they go to bed for just a little while longer, because, you know, that bit is playing in their head, and they're just, you know, because I have had some moments reading things. I think probably one of my favorite incidents was when I read H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Rats on the Walls, for the first time.
One of my favorites of his.
Yeah. Yeah, I finished reading that, and then something starts scratching in the wall behind my chair, and I literally screamed and yeeted the book across the room. It was like, oh boy, yikes! There was actual scratching in the wall, and I was just reading about scratching in the wall. So, yeah, what you know you've arrived as a horror author when something in a story causes one of your readers to contact you in some way, shape, or form and say, you know, I can't look at such and such thing now quite the same way. I did that. That happened to me with another story of mine that involved, I don't want to get too much into it, but it involved somebody reanimating a roast turkey. And then one of my coworkers at my day job turns to me and says, "Hey, I read your story and such, and now I can't look at frozen turkeys quite the same way anymore." On top of the plot twist, this was around Christmas, and there were a lot of people buying frozen turkeys for their Christmas dinner. So I was like, "You just told me the best thing ever."
I think one of the coolest things you can do in horror writing is to make something that's an everyday thing scary.
Yeah,
Like it wasn't horror, but Doctor Who did that with the Autons when they had mannequins that you see everywhere suddenly come to life and attack people. It's like you see them every day in your life if you go into a store.
yeah,
So I think
exactly.
you can take everyday items and turn them into
Yeah.
something frightening. That's cool.
Yeah, I think John Barrowman, who plays Jack Harkness on Doctor Who and in Torchwood, I think that happened to him as a kid growing up and watching Doctor Who. It got to the point where he had to hide his face in his mother's like her arm or something when they were going shopping, and he would see the store mannequins. I was like, oh boy, and then he grew up to be on Doctor Who.
Yes.
That is a scary premise. Store mannequin. It's funny, just
They're scary anyway.
it is scary all around. There's two things that come to mind. I had interviewed about 8 months ago an environmental conservationist in Paris, and he just finished a book called Stone Child, and I read it, and the premise is in London, all these statues, they've got statues going back to Shakespeare and before. Some of them start coming to life in delivering an environmental message. And it was a scary premise for me. And this is quote contemporary novel, not a horror novel, but you know what? It was horror for me. And it was really, his name's Kevin Albin, and it's called Stone Child. But you're talking about mannequins coming to life, so statues.
Doctor
Like-
Who did that with the Weeping Angel statues.
Oh boy.
So, it's powerful. And then in the 40s, there was a movie called One Touch of Venus.
Oh, yeah, sure. I
Yeah.
know it.
Yeah, I loved that was with Ava Gardner early in her career. There's a statue of Venus in a department store, and the window dresser is fixing the statue to have it unveiled, and he just kisses the statue because it's so pretty, and the next thing he knows, the statue came to life, and it was Venus. But that's a nice kind of story.
Remember the Twilight Zone episode where
The After Hours.
Yeah.
The After Hours, that was the
They
best
did that
thing
in
I
the
ever
original
saw.
run. They did that one in the original run, and then they remade it when they brought.
I remember that. I think that was the best thing it had to do with the mannequin I ever saw.
Yeah, that was a really good episode.
Yep, they had the 13th floor,
Uh-huh.
which if you were a human being, you couldn't go to, but if you were a mannequin, it
Yep.
was okay.
Wow.
Yeah, I think Anne Francis was in the original
Anne
version of that.
Francis, yep,
Yeah.
she was a star. And she
Yeah.
wound up, she found out she was a mannequin at the end of the movie.
Yeah, they got like a
Wow.
month to go off and be a human being.
Wow. That's a great plot. I missed that one.
That's Rod Serling. That's a good one to
That's a good
the atmosphere. You talk, that's something that's lost in a lot of modern films. that was something that was done with not big budget, not big special effects, but it had a great atmosphere to it.
Hey, since we're talking about, and this is way off topic, but I'd love to hear your impressions on this. Fantasy, not horror, but a little bit fantasy. So The Wizard of Oz,
Mm.
which I watch, I watch a few times a year. I love it. I from early on, I started telling my wife 30, 40 years ago, what if, and you can comment on this, what if Dorothy awakens after that dream that she's been to Oz and she's lying in bed there in the Kansas farm, and Auntie M and they're all there in real life, and they pull the blanket off her and she's wearing those ruby slippers.
Ooh,
That would have been a nice touch.
yeah, that would be a great touch.
Isn't that a better way to end that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I like that. Somebody's got to do that version.
Okay, I just,
Have any of you seen Tin Man?
Hmm.
Have you seen that? Anybody? Tin Man? It was a sci-fi network did. It was
Oh,
like a
Yeah,
reimagined,
I'm
Yeah,
familiar
reimagining of the
with
Wizard
it.
of Oz, sort of
Yeah.
a science fiction thing. I really liked that. It was like a mini series.
Yeah, I saw that forever ago.
That's the
I
best.
own it on DVD.
12 or 13 years ago, I think that was on.
Yeah.
I didn't see the whole thing, but I definitely remember it.
Yeah.
another movie that resonates with me is The Thing.
Which version? The original or
The original with James Arness plays the.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think that was pure horror science fiction for me. And I marvel, and I'm a real, what I watched the other night? I told my wife, I don't know why I did this. I guess I have too much time on my hands. But I watched Steve McQueen in The Blob.
Ooh,
Yeah.
oh, that's a
Sure.
classic.
that's a good one.
Did you know they every year at that theater? Isn't that theater in Jersey,
It's
Yeah.
Pennsylvania, I think.
Pennsylvania? Okay, every year at that theater they run that movie, and you can go see the movie at that theater.
Wow.
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 Oh,
Yeah, that
wow.
would be cool to do. That's sort of a bucket list thing I would like to do.
Wow. So I watched The Blob, and it was made in the 50s, 57, I think. And I was so, I don't know why I watched it, and it was so bad.
It's
I
fun.
mean, bad. The dialogue was terrible. And it really was bad. But the premise, there's an interesting premise there.
The monster concept was brilliant.
Yes.
And the idea that it was the teenagers that had to fight the monster and the authority figures were baffled or
Right.
didn't believe it. Yeah, I thought of the kids versus the monsters. That was probably one of the better films of its kind.
Exactly.
Well, that came out in the time when the Blackboard Jungle came out, and a lot of movies depicting and what's the name with James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause.
Yeah.
In other words, they were documenting the rebellion of young youth in the 50s. And of course, The Blob was the antithesis because they were heroes.
Yeah.
While most movies were depicting kids as juvenile delinquents.
And I want to say that actually ties in. I think we talked about this on the other Lifeblood 2 thing, was the Gorbals vampire again, which you guys were involved in that one. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but in the 50s in Scotland, there was a story about a vampire, a 7-foot tall vampire with steel fangs in this cemetery.
Huh.
Well, the story spread amongst the kids in the town. The adults were kind of kept out of it. What did the kids do? They didn't go tell the parents about it. They gathered together, got big sticks and stuff, and went into the cemetery where they thought it was and tried to kill this vampire for nights in a row.
Oh my
Until the police
gosh.
caught on to it, and then it got into the whole. All the parents were like, "What's going on with this?" And the funny thing about that, I think the funniest punchline about that, it tells you something about Scotland. Most towns would kind of downplay this and like, oh, this is an embarrassing moment. No, they have a big mural about it, and they're really proud of that. It's a claim to fame for this town. But I almost think I couldn't find any evidence about it, but I still think that it was sort of had to be part of the inspiration for the Lost Boys, because that's really what that is.
Yeah.
The kids are the only ones that know about it, and they're going out to fight it.
Mm.
But yeah, so that's sort of the same premise with the kids are rising up to fight something.
And you mentioned England, Scotland,
Great Britain.
the American Werewolf in London,
Oh yeah.
Mm.
petrified. Petrified. I mean, and as an adult, I saw it, and the power, the power of horror and imagination. What you guys do is enormous power, because it could take me as an adult and leave me chilled.
Mm.
And that's, that's the power in what you guys do as horror writers, and even contemporizing it, as you did, Renee, with Edna. Boy, I'd love to see a short little film on that.
Oh, so would I.
Like a short little video, a short film.
Yeah.
That's
On
really
that.
so fun.
And it's funny. I thought that the clincher for me was the last line.
Mm.
In Edna, that's to me, that's just a powerful last line. So I just want to remind folks, I think we've covered, if anybody has any other, listen, we could talk for hours.
Oh my God.
I mean,
Great group we got here.
yeah, we could talk for hours and hours on this, on Lifeblood 2, and on your work, and on the true, on the fiction, on the nonfiction. But I do want to remind folks, I'm just kind of looking at the table of contents, for folks. I saved the Beatles.
Yeah. I like that. I mean, you know what? That's probably one of my favorite stories I've ever written.
Yeah, it's just a real quick little summary of that.
It's a
If
first
you want
person.
to, if you want to.
Yeah, it's fine. It's a first person story, recounted by a guy who's a vampire, but he's an interesting vampire because he doesn't kill. He refuses to kill. He works in a mortuary, and he takes blood from the corpses that come in instead. And he's recounting a story that happened in 1964 when the Beatles came to New York City, and one of his fellow vampires, who he's decided probably was a serial killer before she was turned into a vampire,
Oh boy.
decides she wants to kill one or two of the Beatles. He realizes he wasn't sure. And so he has to stop her from doing that, because he's also a musician and a big music fan, and he doesn't want to see the Beatles get killed. And I love I think I love the best about that is the last line, which he says at the end, I'm going to leave you with one thing, which is to say, obla di, obla da, which I thought was great.
That is great. That is great. So, I will never cover it all. We'll never cover it all, but this was great. And I want to thank you all for giving up part of your July 5th.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
This is a lot of fun as always, Calvin.
Yep. I think this is very special. beginning with our hat wearing and your passion, and we got a chance to really do some like I said, come back, because we
Anytime.
just go on and on and on. You know, I have this love of film, especially, and I also have this love of the written word, and I plunged into this. So Gary, and Mike and Renee, thank you so much for
Thank you.
sharing your time.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
yeah, and please do come back, because there's a lot more things to chat about. And you know what I love about the chemistry, we just ramble on. We go from where we were to talking about so many different topics, and I think that's great. And that's good chemistry. So please do come back.
Oh, you sure will.
Anytime, my
Be an
friend.
honor.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks, folks.
Okay.